This is it, right?
Yeah.
That's perfect.
Showtime.
Perfect. Yeah, stragglers, yeah.
Well, good evening. Thank you so much for coming tonight. My name is Katie
Charlie.
Hirsch.
Charlie.
I need to turn off my phone.
I'm Katie Hirsch. I'm the director and chief curator of the Halsey Institute of Contemporary Art. I'm so excited to welcome you this evening for a talk between art city artist Nancy Friedemann-Sánchez and Dr. Cristina Garcia. They are here. We're sitting in and among Pinturas de Casta and the Construction of American Identity, which opened on Friday and will be on view through July 16th. I'm going to introduce Nancy and Cristina and then get out of the way and let them have this amazing conversation. Nancy Friedemann-Sánchez is a Colombian American artist with an interdisciplinary practice. She grew up in Colombia as the child of a Colombian and a United States citizen and migrated to the U.S. as an adult. Her art is about the curious and intense experience of having physically migrated, yet still having a piece of herself rooted in Colombia. I know it's awkward to hear yourself talked about.
Yeah.
Wonderfully. In her work, she is creating an intersectional feminist visual novel, of which the series Casta Paintings is a chapter, that is a multifaceted project comprised of paintings, sculptures, objects, and mixed media that together and in different voices weave a synchronicity of dialogues, passages, and punctuations about hybridity and cultural ownership. She earned her MFA from New York University and is the recipient of such awards as the Doctoral Prize in Painting, a Smithsonian Artist Fellowship, and a Pollock Krasner Grant, among others. She's exhibited her work at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Miami, the Portland Museum of Art, and El Museo del Barrio in New York, again, among many others. She was also selected for the Elizabeth Sackler Feminist Art Base at the Brooklyn Museum. Nancy lives in Lincoln, Nebraska, and together with her husband, artist Charlie Friedemann, here this evening, their lovely daughter as well, Nancy runs Fiendish Plots, an artist-run initiative and exhibition space, a creator on many levels. She will be in conversation tonight with Dr. Cristina Garcia, an assistant professor in the Department of Hispanic Studies here at the College of Charleston. She earned her PhD in Spanish and Portuguese from the University of California, Irvine. Cristina's research centers on literary and visual works from the Hispanophone Caribbean, drawing on eco-critical methods of formal analysis. She is particularly interested in how aesthetic techniques can provide alternative forms of imagining the physical body and its environment, especially when reimagining works to unsettle the secure boundaries of the human. You can see why we paired these two.
Yeah.
We're very thrilled to feature them in conversation this evening. Free admission to the Halsey Institute and to events like this are courtesy of our members and supporters, so thank you so much. There will be a Q&A to follow, and for those of you online, you can type your questions into the chat box and we will relay them to Nancy and Cristina. So without further ado, I present in conversation Nancy Friedemann-Sánchez and Cristina Garcia.
Thank you. Katie, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the Halsey for creating this jaw-dropping exhibition and for the privilege to be able to be here and ask Nancy all my burning questions. Nancy, one of the things that I find so compelling and exciting about your work, it's something that I think culminates in the Casta paintings, but that you can trace along your different bodies of work. And it's this insistence on the planar, on the two-dimensional design. I see it as an aesthetic strategy that has political implications. And so for those of you that might not be familiar with some of Nancy's other work, I'll give you an example. She has ink drawings where she reproduces the most intricate, beautiful patterns of lace and crochet, flora and fauna, historically feminine ornamental designs. And whether it's ink on Tyvek or your depiction of entangled, dense bouquets and barniz de pasto, we see these linear patterns and iconography that we often associate with intimate and domestic spaces. And you create them in these monumental compositions. Some of these imagine floor to ceiling. It's almost as though the feminine in your intricate and delicate designs invades architectural spaces with proliferating complex webs. And so I want to suggest that the crochet or the lace that Nancy designs is like a web or a network. And what I'm trying to get at is that what I see, how I understand Nancy's work is almost as a visual correlate to what many contemporary ecofeminist philosophers have argued for. And that is to see and relate to the world as an entangled web or complex networks of interdependencies, as opposed to individual isolated bodies or landscapes that we can organize into compartments or easily recognize and identify. Such classifications, by the way, are the necessary science for establishing social hierarchies and discriminations. And such classifications are what the colonial Casta paintings intend to achieve. So in your Casta paintings, you are responding to and contesting a colonial tradition of organizing and cataloging bodies that, as you know, continues today through other mediums. It persists through different lenses and technologies, turning to these silhouettes or ghostly maps, as you call them. And maps are also an important trope for these feminist thinkers because they present horizontal relationships or points of connections that can be redrawn. You don't give us volumetric, three-dimensional bodies that one could presumably see inside, which is what the TSA machines intend to do. And if you guys didn't notice already, they're in the position as someone that's going through the TSA machine. So rather, you leave us with a trace, with marks, with the residue of what appears like biochemical processes or decompositions. They're configurations. They're not discrete bodies that lend themselves to compartmentalization. Do you see yourself as working against the logic of classification or certain regimes of organizing bodies? And if so, how?
Well, I see the classifications, these historical classifications that are presented to us via history, via colonization, as these events and ways of thinking and dominant ideologies that are inescapable. I find those structures and those modes of producing knowledge as inescapable. And I work inside of that. It's kind of like I understand the rules and I play inside with those rules, but contest it and present it back, filter it back and present it back. So you can look at that past and you can understand your present. So for example, what you were mentioning about the tracings. So the tracings for me are the tracings of identity, like when you are going through a TSA machine and you are being traced by a machine. It's supposed to be, so you don't have to see that you're not carrying guns or, illicit something. But we're also traced digitally through the web, how we shop, what we shop. Right now it's for shopping. We don't know what it will be for in the future, correct? But I think it's about identity, and it's about that tracing of identity, and then it can refer back to the camera obscura of how those were also ways of understanding humans. And I think, again, like the cataloging. I'm interested in the cataloging because humans have always cataloged each other. And the ones that are at the top are the ones that are going to do more cataloging, or the ones that are at the bottom for whatever reason. So, and it's a way of othering, and at the end, it's dehumanizing. And that moment when you're going through that TSA machine, you are dehumanized. Hopefully you come out to the other side and you get to your destination, correct? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And I love the way that you talked about how drawing, there are these sort of already structures that exist in place. And so it's not sort of this idea of creating this entirely new, unique vision, but you draw from those very structures. Yeah. You create your own taxonomy, yeah. But while also complicating the very notion of taxonomy, yes. Right? So these are Casta paintings. Yeah. And there is, the TSA machine tries to look at you in a way that's very objective and very transparent, but like you said, there's another trace, there's another identity. But I feel like the way that you think of identity is a lot more complex than it's very particular. Yeah. It's very unique. I would even say it's a singular, right? Because identity, it's almost very unique to each individual. There's patterns here, right? That are, even though there's a sort of uniformity to the chapter, there's these particular textures that are absolutely unique, right? The trace or the residue.
And which I connect to my own education in the US. So I connect this, for example, to the works of Helen Frankenthaler, of the idea of the stain, the idea of that more feminized gesture. So I'm interested not only in the idea of colonization and who we are in the world, but also how we are taught. I mean, as a Latin American coming to the US to be educated in the US, I mean, I stepped into the dominant culture. I mean, from this person from the little country in South America coming to New York or to LA to go and study here. I mean, that is, the sole gesture of that is completely kind of rendering yourself, walking in willingly into the dominant sphere and to accepting the values of that. So when you were saying, like, where I always stand in between kind of like doubt and affirmation. I don't think of my work ever as dogmatic, as I'm saying, this is about colonization. I think of it as everything that it does to me, that it, you know, where is it that my daughter is colonized? Or where is it that I keep being colonized? Or I think of my materials. How are they? My materials are Tyvek. It comes out from, it's a petrochemical derivative. So we're all in it. It's unavoidable, right?
Right. Those networks.
It's those networks.
Embedded.
And again, it's when you mention ecofeminism, it's everything petroleum is the extraction of our resources, but without the considerations of land, of people, of animals. So yeah.
No, and you're talking about it, made me think too. So you're talking about the sort of the industrial material, right, that you use, and in a way, because these are just traces, and you have these sort of processes. I mean, it feels to me that more than anything, I'm thinking of that corporeal body, like the body that's not there, the body that's absent, the body that you used, right, to trace, and the sort of impermanence and duration and time and things that are of concern, right, for an environmental perspective. But I want to connect something else that you were talking about, these conversations and these dialogues that you have with other thinkers and how you've been impacted, because I think that speaks to the way that you conceive of your work. And you've described it as, and Katie mentioned this, as a visual novel, and you divide your work into chapters as opposed to series. So can you tell us how the media and the genre of the novel help you conceive of your work, and how you imagine the reception of individual pieces by framing your work as a visual novel? In other words, how might someone see and understand an individual piece knowing that it's part of a larger novel? How might that impact our reception of it?
Well, I mean, there are various reasons of why I decided to call this body of work that keeps growing a visual novel. And I think as an artist, or if you're a writer or a poet, I mean, you're always making work. You always have the same thing that bothers you. The same thing that bothers you. You have, I call it a run. You have the same thing that bothers you that you're always trying to figure out. I even think that if you're not a visual artist or a writer or a poet, we all have those things that are always in our heads going. And for me, those are the relationships of, well, it's there in the statement that Katie read, the relationships of North and South, having grown up in Colombia with an American dad, being always bicultural in between languages, in between cultures. I think that's always been, I've always been watching what is this in the US, what is this in Latin America, how does that compare here? Even walking through Charleston, we visited a plantation, and I'm thinking, oh, this is like the fincas in Cartagena with the same, Cartagena was like Charleston, biggest port of entry for slaves in Latin America, that and Veracruz in Mexico.
Right.
So there's so many parallels, but in our state of colonization, there usually, or this is my point of view, usually there's no correlation. The US is kind of like independent and up here and dominant and doesn't ever compare itself to Latin America, maybe more to Europe. And I see much more relationship to that. So that is one of the origins of this idea of this novel, of this complex narrative. And then the other is, because this is a complex narrative, there are many aspects of it. Okay, so there's Casta, there is the riches that the Americas gave to Europe. When you visit the British Museum, or when you're in London or Madrid, the architecture is imposing, right? It's all given by us over here from the North and South America. So that's part of the cornucopia chapter, and it all kind of extends in that way. So, I mean, a novel has a plot, it has character development, it has a climax, and I'm not exactly sure because I'm still in chapter 6 or 7, but I'm developing this narrative about this thing, this relationship of power, trying to understand this past that is so problematic for all of us. For all of us. I mean, when there is a shooting in Buffalo, it's completely connected to colonization, to slavery, to
Casta paintings.
Yes, to Casta paintings, because Casta paintings were commissioned to create categorizations, kind of like in those Linnaeus, like the paintings of Catesby of the Magnolia. It's like, let's depict who's coming up there, what is this crazy mixture of races that are happening in Mexico and then in Peru, and and then the names, salta atrás, jump backwards, no te entiendo, I don't understand you, mulata, which is mule, and all of these names that are loba, and which are names that still exist. They exist when you say jíbara in Puerto Rico, it means that you're from Puerto Rico. If you say loba in Colombia, it means somebody with very little taste. There are all of these names that are connected to something that is derogative.
Yeah.
And that then gets injected in the culture and travels through time.
Mm-hmm. And determines the way that we see and relate to individual people, because there are these hierarchies that have been established, these strata.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other thing too about thinking of your work as like a text, aside from all these other subplots or sub-narratives, but there's also the subtext and what you're trying to refer when you were saying earlier about those histories that are not recognized.
Right.
For instance, the riches, right? Like the
Right.
riches, like what made possible the European Renaissance and those and the luxury and all of that abundance and the cornucopia
Right.
was the exploitation that
Right.
was going on
Yeah.
in the Americas.
Yeah.
And so I feel that you want us, right, to call to bring that memory
Yeah.
back, those
Yeah.
connections.
Yeah.
I'm thinking another way of memory in a more tangible way that appears in your work, another trend that I see across your chapters is there's the pictorial two-dimensional surface, and then there's a thing, an object. There's this juxtaposition between the found object and then the design.
Yeah.
Is this something that you've thought about, this relationship? What do these objects do?
So the objects are all found, and if they're found on eBay. So they are. I basically take, if you know what a ready-made is, it's a Duchampian, you know, the urinal by Duchamp, who completely revolutionized 20th century art and gave artists of the 20th century the permission to appropriate objects and call them art and take them for their own. And so initially I had two masks. My mother was an anthropologist, so here I am. I'm not the product of myself, but I come from somewhere. And she was, well, I won't go through her career, but she was very influential. And she had two masks, two from the Amazon, and two combs, these Spanish combs, that she would wear for balls when she was a teenager or in her late teens, early 20s. And kind of, you know how St. Patrick's is celebrated or you know, Oktoberfest. There were these, you know, in Colombia there were bullfights and people would go to the bullfight with the bota and the mantilla and the peineta and to parties. And the way I see it now, I did not understand. I just found it amazing. It was kept in a hat box very carefully.
They are very beautiful.
They're very beautiful with her, you know, with her silk mantilla and all. And then of course I see it, you know, as an assertion of Europeanness and a denial of the indigenous, which in Latin America, it's impossible to be completely white, completely European, because colonization happened with ships of men. So miscegenation started at 0, at 1492. So, but there's still a denial. There's still a denial of that history. And so I thought of that first, I mean, as a point of self-criticism. I mean, this is in my own family. And I know, because I've seen old photos, that I have indigenous in my, you know, I have Chibcha. It's there. And again, it's identity. So identity is fluid. It's could be like lace. It lets see, it doesn't see. You choose. You say what you are, right? You present yourself. And so the masks, I was thinking of, I first had these two and her two combs, and then the bodies kind of appeared, you know, one day in the studio. Just let's do a trace of my daughter. You know, why don't you lie down on this table and let me trace you? And it kind of happened, you know, creatively. You're working in the studio. And gradually it was like, well, let's see where I can find them. So I went on eBay and I started thinking about capitalism, and capitalism again as another form of colonization. And capitalism is always pushing for more productivity and more exploitation. And I started finding, in some cases, masks that should be in museums, but that are in somebody's basement. And it was a little bit shocking, and so I started going on this other adventure, which was, well, let's bring them out via, you know, the ready-made, the Duchampian ready-made, via capitalism, and bring them out from these places of lowness, of invisibility, and make them visible again.
That's beautiful. So in part, it's almost like a reclaiming. I mean, the works are about so much, but in part, it's about reclaiming these masks and how they've been sort of devalued and not recognized. That's fantastic. And then also your the way that you recognize your own embeddedness, right, in certain economies. It's sort of inevitable. I feel that there's always so much research and knowledge in what you do. And I'm going to get to that. I have a question that I want to get to that, but I want to go back to the museum and to your mom being an anthropologist, because I've also noticed that in other chapters, you'll sometimes have like a table, and then you'll have these small uniform objects lined up in the table, or you'll have another piece that has funerary urns. How do those objects work for you? Or does that all come from that experience of growing up with an anthropologist? Or?
Well, the objects in some of the other pieces, they're more like suggestions. I'm never really, I love craft, and I always think of craft as fine art. So every object that I make, I want to be invested in it as if it was. And then there's the narrative, which I think it's the other part of the novel. I think I love telling stories, and I sometimes regale these two beautiful characters here with all the stories from Bogota, you know, or from growing up. And so Charlie and I were talking about this morning, about how one day we were driving in the countryside. I was really young, maybe, 11 years old, and the car breaks down, and my grandmother takes off. She looks in there and she says, "Oh, it's the belt," and she takes off her pantyhose and she makes a belt.
She was resourceful. She's really smart.
But this is Latin America. This is Latin America. This was not, another time there was a big rainstorm and the water was coming in the house. And she went to the bathroom and grabbed this soap bar, and she squished it and mushed it. There was no putty, and she started puttying all the holes in the windows where the water was coming in. And so I think of these stories are kind of behind the work, but they are reflections of the larger culture. I mean, this is my grandmother, but this is not just my grandmother. This is Latin America. It's kind of this resourceful thing of like, well, we need to make this out of, these three things, and how do we do it? And so I think that's No, that's fantastic.
Yeah. And then of course, those are the stories that you know, and then there's also the stories that we don't know that these masks come with, right?
Yeah.
These invisible stories that are embedded in the material of the mask that we don't. All of this memory. And so when you've talked about the Casta paintings, you've said, and I'm going to quote you, "I'm also interested in the aspect of reacquiring knowledge by doing research into themes like 18th century genre of Casta paintings." And with regard to the Barniz de Pasto, you've talked about the research that you've done into indigenous iconography and the craft itself. And yet in other instances, you've also talked about your work as a palimpsest of cultural memory. And so have you thought of your work as an archive or as and I think we've already said a little bit, but as another mode of producing and collecting knowledge?
Yeah. Well, I think that's where I'm the daughter of an anthropologist. That's
And I know
Yeah.
you've mentioned that you spent a lot of time in museums too.
Yeah. So my mom would take me to the National Museum where she had her office, and she would say, you know, I'm finishing this article. Go and roam the museum, and I could visit all the parts that were not available to the public, and I would see all the cases organized with the handwritten, you know, notes by archaeologists, and it was so, and she would take me to the places where she was doing field work. So in another occasion, another little parenthesis, just to give texture, you know, to the story, we were in Barbacoas, which is in the south of Colombia by the Putumayo River, and she was doing research on the Afro-Colombian people that live that are miners and that use the techniques that indigenous people used before the conquest, and they're still mining, and they're making works that contain visually and iconographically the memories of Africa, because they look like objects made still with the memory of Africa. And well, she's doing this very serious work. I'm staying with the woman of the house, and she says to me, help me sell paletas, which are like ice cream, you know, popsicles. And she opens the window, and at the time, I had really long hair, and I didn't like to brush it. And so I come out with this hair like this in the window, and all of these Afro-Colombian kids that are coming to buy the popsicles, they look at me and they start screaming
No
and
te peinaste el
crying.
pelo.
And they're like, La Mojana, La Mojana. This is the white witch that steals the children. So I think of those stories, they become little origin stories that you don't forget.
Yeah. But it's amazing too, the way, because that story and that experience is what frames, or it's on the outside of that research, that field project that your mom was doing. So your mom is she's working within a particular discipline, in a science, and she's producing her own knowledge, and you go on to produce your knowledge, but in a very different way. And so you had that experience, and that also becomes part of like your archive. But I feel, I don't want to say that it's not that you'd be anti-anthropology or anti-certain disciplines, but it does seem to me that you're insisting on a different way of knowing. Right? Like a certain, and you mentioned this in the video, which if you guys should go see the video, you have an opportunity. You talk about, I think about ambiguity or ambivalence.
Yeah.
And when I see these, and I think of your experience in the museum and your mom collecting, this is a collection, right? You did your field work, you collected your masks, you ordered them, you have your system, but then you're insisting on something else, like these silhouettes, right? It's on something that's not tangible. Like I can't objectify this. Yeah. I can't presume that I know this, right? In a objective, transparent way. In other words, I feel like you're working against the transparency of the TSA machine, like sort of really working, resisting that in some ways. I want to, so going back to not necessarily the novel, but the novel has a title, and the title is Mestiza dos veces. So mestiza is an identity and a process that has a long and complex history in the Latin American imaginary. It's at times been really revolutionary, and at times been a standard against which people are measured. What does it mean to you?
Well, to me, it means being a hybrid. It means, we were saying the other day, or even today, mestiza could be mestiza dos veces, tres, cuatro, cinco. I mean, it has to do with gender, with geography, with history, with education, with economics. I mean, it's all it's all, for me, it means it's that attempt of cultural ownership of something that doesn't stay still, that is fluid. And I think that's maybe even why there's no volume. They're tracings, because tracings they're kind of, they can be wispy, right? They can be see-through. They can be like lace. They can be like you see and you don't see. So
yeah, no, and that's fantastic. And also, not just mestiza in terms of your own biography, your parents, but also your intellectual formation. I mean, you're constantly drawing from, we talked about North American art history, European art history, colonial, indigenous art history, and they're always, to one degree or another, in flux and speaking to each other.
Yeah. And a love of both.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. Not a rejection of one for the other, but always that sort of contact. Yeah. No, I think that thinking of the way that using that you sort of claim that term and looking at the term in the context of your work, I think what you retain about the idea of being mestiza or the process of mestizaje is that contact of that difference, and then that not necessarily a harmonious fusion, right, or an archetype that then we can get that becomes an ideal, but very much in terms of just the meeting of difference and the constant negotiation and dialogue. Your barniz de pasto, you mentioned earlier too about your love of lo artesanal and your appreciation for it. So your work with barniz de pasto is explicitly engaged with and invested in sustaining this artisanal tradition, and you collaborate with one of the few artisans still working in this practice. Do you see your work as also contesting or complicating the distinctions between craft and art and certain mythologies of the artist?
Yeah. So to explain it a little bit further, barniz de pasto is a tradition in Colombia, and if you have the time and the interest, barniz de pasto is a tradition that goes back to pre-conquest times, and you see it different plant, because I've discussed this with conservators, but the queros from Peru and their beads from Colombia, they are made in something similar to barniz de pasto. They come from a bud that grows, again, in the Putumayo Basin, and that is later, during pre-conquest times, they were stretched and colored with natural materials to cover especially wooden objects or wooden beads. And in the colony, there was a huge development, in part because there was commerce between Europe and Asia. So, and you see a lot of chinoiserie here in Charleston. There were all of these ships, the Manila galleon ships, that were going to Asia, and they were bringing silk, porcelain, and Chinese lacquer, which was extremely prized in European courts and in the families that were very important in the Americas. So when the Spanish arrive in the south of Colombia, they see that the indigenous people are making, and same thing in Mexico, they see that they're making something that looks like barniz de pasto. And they say, and they imagine an indigenous person given an example of Chinese lacquer with some peonies on it and saying, can you repeat this, but in this kind of object? And so here begins a huge development that still lives today. And in the south of Colombia, there is this tradition that is still practiced by around 38 artisans, 8 harvesters that go down the mountain walking 9 hours after they have been in the bus 9 hours, and they bring back sacks of mopa, which are the buds that are resonant, which still some artisans chew and stretch and color with anilines, with our colors that are made today from coal, another form of colonization, right? Because our colors, our rainbow of colors, do not come from cochineal anymore or from indigo, but from coal. And so they make this, and they make these objects which are beautiful and usually exist in the form of craft. So objects that you find in airports, in the artisan, in the gift shops, but not in the places of high art. So I've been collaborating with this artisan to create objects that can go into museums to represent this practice and to have, this is my aspiration. From here to there will need to be a lot of governmental support. There's a little bit right now, but to be able to make the practice more visible. And so the works are large scale. And so the plan is that they go into museums and that there is equity in the way that when they're sold, that it is divided, that it's not me outsourcing to an artisan, but that there is an equitable share of a profit, and that they go to Colombian institutions to show what this practice is about, and to keep it alive, and hopefully, here going back to ecofeminism, to possibly incentivize people to go into this practice instead of going into logging, for example.
Right, and so much of that too, so it's part of not only the value, giving value and recognition to this craft, but then also perpetuating that knowledge, right? Because so few people still have. How many did you say it was?
38.
38, yeah, it's
38
incredible.
artisans.
Yeah.
It's not a lot.
Yeah. And so,
like,
how has the collaboration been? Are you happy with the pieces?
Yes, we've done one piece, two pieces, a smaller one, which was going to be an example. But one piece went to a big fair that happens in Colombia every year, where the government has an agency that works with indigenous communities and Afro-Colombian communities and farmers and all kinds of artisans. And they present the works in a large fair. It's like an art fair, but it's of all the works of indigenous communities in Colombia. So there are people who come from the Amazon. They get first on a boat, then on a bus, then on another bus, and another bus, and they get to Bogota, and they're there for a month.
To both exhibit and see?
To exhibit, yes.
Okay. Oh,
and
amazing.
so the government is creating these connections between visual artists and artisans to create works that bring the work to reframe it and give it a different lens.
So even at the level of government, there's an effort to reclaim these crafts, right? Or what's deemed as craft, right? In terms of the art world. That kind of leads me to my next question. I wanted to ask you, have you, aside from these pieces by Denise de Pasto, the impression that I have is that most of your exhibits in your artistic career has been in the United States. So what has it been like? Have you exhibited in Colombia, abroad, and is there a difference in reception in terms of your work?
Yeah. Well, I left Colombia 30 years ago, and I kept exhibiting in Colombia. I had a gallery that represented me until 2004. And between 2004 and 2020, I really focused in the US. It was kind of like that effort of, okay, I'm living here, so I have to really focus here. and again, it's making work to understand this, the culture. Where is it? And I would say that there's a transference of identity. I think I went from being a Colombian, a Latin American living in the US, to becoming a US Latina or a US Latinx. And I think in the work, so I just did a book with, so I think there's a reentrance, but it's a reentrance via this, the Barniz de Pasto and I did a book for, where I illustrated a story of a very well-known Afro-Colombian writer. And it's a book that went to many of the rural libraries in the country. So kind of the negotiation with that agency, that publishing house, was to make the book so that it could stand and the images could tell the story, and that the paper would be thick enough that it would not disintegrate in libraries that have no AC.
Right.
So.
And you were successfully able to get those materials, to get that durability in the book. Yeah, that's fantastic. So that's another collaborative project. Yeah, I guess I was wondering, because when you make these references to certain traditions or iconography that would have been familiar to you as a child growing up in Colombia, like the peineta, what that's like, for instance, so when you exhibit it in the United States, there's a certain like preface and contextualization and drawing attention to, well, these flowers were, what have you. And so I'm wondering like what it might be like in Latin America or in Colombia to see your work and maybe not have to make that preface, or not having to contextualize it in that way, or having people maybe recognize or immediately identify with some of the icons or images in your work. So I don't know if...
Well, I have had more opportunities to do that here than there.
Okay,
So I can't answer that.
Right.
Quite.
Okay.
I think
we have yet to know.
I have yet to know. I mean, I think the piece that I showed in the craft fair was received very well, and was kind of like, almost like, oh, like you can do this.
Right.
Like you can do this. But I think it's the eyes of somebody that lives outside of the country, and that recognizes...
Right, so often, Yeah, that's very true.
So in some way, I mean, I think when I go back to Colombia, I'm more excited about many of the cultural things that I see there, more than other Colombians.
Right. Well, they say, Cuban artists, for instance, when they went, the trajectory was that you'd go to Paris in the 20s if you wanted to be a serious artist. And so there's always this change that when they come back from Europe, everything's brighter because the light in the Caribbean, they didn't notice it before. And so when they come back, they're like, And so that changes. And absolutely, being away and coming back gives you these different eyes.
Entirely.
I won't go into a long tangent, but when I go back, I'm from Miami. And so there's certain things that I found either, I don't know, kind of cheesy, or I didn't like, and then I come back and they're kind of quirky and more endearing or fascinating. But it takes that leaving to recognize that. Okay, so finally, my last question is, how do you see your work in dialogue with Kukulis?
Well, I think we deal with so many of the same issues. I think so much of our work we're dealing with colonization, with hybridity, syncretism, the mask, the indigenous, the Spanish. I think there are many elements that we deal.
No, I think you're definitely
content-wise. We handle materials very differently.
You're dealing with
content-wise, many similar.
No, you're definitely both engaged in legacies of colonialism, but such different stylistic approaches, which is why it makes it such a fascinating.
I think also I'm thinking a lot about both U.S. or North America and South America.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas Kukuli may
Yeah.
be more
Yeah.
concentrated, right,
Yeah.
in that particular Andean history. You're
Yeah.
you're also engaged in another mestizaje.
Yeah.
Right. Another
Yeah,
another
and that's
contact
the,
zone.
That's the
The
mestiza
dos veces.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you want to take questions from
Yes.
the audience?
So Nancy,
Oh.
I love it. I was here Friday night and I haven't stopped thinking about the exhibition since. And I'm not familiar with your other work, so I'm going to have to just really want to learn. But I hadn't noticed the TSA pose until you mentioned it. And I think one of you referenced it as like dehumanizing. And I think I was looking around for it as you were talking about it, and I thought to myself, maybe it's an equalizer. Like you're talking about all these different, maybe not the appropriate word, but ethnicities or ethnic groups or, and this typology that was created to define everyone. But yet, you get in this machine and we're really all the same, we're all humans. So that was just what I was thinking about when you were talking.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's not really a question.
No, that's a great comment. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think also it's not entirely about oppression. It's also about resistance. It's both. But I think in the work, I'm always in between, doubt and affirmation. Where is the oppression? Where is the resistance? The resistance is here. The oppression is here. They mingle. They bug you.
Or we can also say this is also what the TSA machine does not catch. Like it doesn't catch these
Yes.
flowers.
No,
it doesn't
doesn't.
catch these.
yeah, so Nancy, I wanted to ask about the novel, I guess. And it's kind of always low-hanging fruit to ask an artist what comes next. But you've got 6 or 7 chapters of a bigger opus. And I'm wondering about kind of where that's headed, perhaps. I mean, there's a great intentionality here to there's 16 images
Yeah.
part of the series. You may even know how many chapters you want to have in that bigger composition, as it were. Can you tell us something about what it might look like, where you're headed with that?
Well, I just had a solo show in Nebraska at Wesleyan University, and I made a table that references painting, that uses Amazon paintings. Again, kind of, maybe it's that direction. I'm not sure. I think the other reason, which is it's more strategic. Working on different chapters allows me also to, when I get stuck in one, I can, like the one thing that terrifies me is to be stuck. So if I get stuck in one, I can run to a different chapter. Like these took 4 years to make. And so I would make 2 or 3 and then move on to, like a cornucopia piece. And then, those have been fairly successful. So they have been kind of a little bit, again, it's the still life. So the still life, everybody loves the still life. That's
The cornucopia.
the cornucopia.
Yeah.
And that's other layers of the onion, oh, here we go. This is, you're in this form that is very likable and it's beautiful. It's
accessible.
accessible, excessive, baroque. It hits many notes. And so when I get fed up of that, I run back to this, or I collaborate with Charlie. We did a whole show together during the pandemic. So I think I allow things to be it's the chapters also allow me to move to, to allow different voices, which is again identity. Identity is different voices. It's the different multitudes that we are inside.
Sorry, I want to ask, was that the first time that you guys collaborated, or had you guys collaborated before?
We had been in a show together, and we put our work side by side.
Okay.
And we were like, wow, this works, even though it's so different. And during the pandemic, a little gallery in Omaha invited us to show, and they said, there will be no opening, no reception, and,
No wine
and it's by appointment. And, you're stuck in your house. You're like, you can't go in full lockdown. We just said, let's, and you're thinking of the politics and surveillance and guns and we started making this collaboration together, and it became a chapter. So these things, I don't know.
It's organic.
It's very organic. But again, it's about the things that bug you all the time.
I'll speak for the online viewers. We have 3 questions. And the first is about the flowers in the pieces, which was that they seem to be very specific for each work, and that the masks are specific to each work, so that was there any correlation between, if they're a specific species of flower, and are they assigned to a piece for a reason? Did I represent that person? Okay. I'm sorry.
So the flowers are all inspired in Spanish colonial paintings. So I have been looking and archiving, and this goes back to the question of the archivist as artist. I have been looking and archiving different flowers that appear in different colonial objects, paintings, barniz de pasto, Mexican lacquer, just all kinds of these images. And the flowers on the bodies, they have various references. It's the mantilla, it's Spanish colonial painting, it's femininity, it's ornament as a way also to mask. The ornament also masks, works like the mask. And each mask for example, that one is called castiza, the one in the middle, but that is a representation of whiteness. My guess is that it was created by a person of color. So it has an element of a way of seeing white people. And I picked it and also during the colony, the idea of castizas was you could return to whiteness if you mixed with Spanish. If you were indigenous and you mixed with white, and there has been a whole history in Latin America of el blanqueamiento de la raza, to whiten, to not go in the sun, don't get too much color, don't let the genes come out. Yeah. So I think I play with these. That one is called Spanish, Española. So it's that the hybridity of, being indigenous but presenting as Spanish. And, so you look indigenous, but you say, no, I'm Spanish. Right? And that is, that's Latin America also, which is, it's that individual denial or aspiration, or it's the aspiration to not be discriminated. It's so,
But
So-
but you're showing that it's constructed,
Yeah.
right? Like what constitutes
Right.
whiteness? A peineta,
Right, a
right? A
peineta.
certain
Right.
accessory, right? A certain
Right.
way of
Yes.
performing. That,
Yes, right, that
Yeah.
identity is
Yeah.
performance
yeah.
as well.
So the second question is about, which is actually something I hadn't thought to wonder about the actual Tyvek that the work is on and composed of, and the creases. And are the creases in the Tyvek intentional, or did you leave the creases?
Yeah,
Great question.
well, to me, the material refers to, the petrochemical, that the black, I'm thinking of artists like Zurbarán, like Sánchez Cotán, but also like Richard Serra. The creases are the Midwest quilt. It's where I live right now. And it's also the grid. It's the modernist grid. It's the linear grid. It's the grid of science. It's the grid of
The compartments.
the compartments. Yeah. So it is,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. That's fantastic. And you mentioned Suburan, and you've in the website, I think you talk about it, other pieces as like chiaroscuro.
Yeah.
But it's so intense, the contrast between the color,
Yeah.
the brightness, and the black background, that it's almost like you collapse, right? Like chiaroscuro intended to create that sort of volumetric
Yeah.
illusion, but your chiaroscuro is so intense that it again insists on that, on
Yeah.
that flatness, on that, bringing it back to the surface. Sorry, you had a third.
The question was a turn from talking about the formal qualities, which was, is there a place, this person asked, where they can view the work that you're creating with the mopa artisans?
Yeah.
Online, I think.
Yes, right now it's online and there's a little video. And we've only made one piece. So the project is just at its beginnings. Yeah. Yeah, but it will be, yeah. It will exist.
Well, thank you.
Oh,
I noticed some of your images have multiple arms and legs and some don't. And what does that symbolize? Like some of them only have like maybe 2 legs or 4 legs and 4 arms, and some like, that one has like 6 arms and 6
Mhm.
legs.
it's the mixture of identity.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's the mixture of identity. Yeah.
Like all the different races.
Yeah, yeah, and again, identity as this psychological, complicated, right? Like this thing that is,
And movement too,
Yeah.
because it's the same person that you're
Right.
retracing silhouettes, so different histories and
right.
And I have a question, or rather it's a prompt, because we have had this conversation, but I wanted for others to kind of hear, where we talked about the individuals who did come to be traced.
Yeah.
And what that experience was like, and Christina talking about the reference to the body that's come up there, that these were women who came, and I know people might be interested to hear how they came to be on top of the Tyvek and that experience
Yeah.
tracing their body for
Yeah.
this work.
Yeah. So the process to make the bodies was I invited different women in the community, different Latina women. I started first with Nina, and then Charlie traced me, and then I had those 2 pieces, and then I invited a friend, and then it became gradually people that I didn't know, mothers with daughters, and I mean, in some cases, for me, it was very delicate. Like I could just see that there was shyness and uncomfort of being there. So I would say to, you know, like a mother to draw her daughter and vice versa. And I could see like I invited a few, like I wanted different bodies. And that was a little bit hard. Like only one friend who is large said, okay, I will pose. But different women were just, didn't feel comfortable. And of course that made me think very much about how we feel as women about our bodies. And our, you know, that is part of a kind of colonization that we live, you know.
That's actually another fascinating aspect, because we've been thinking about the ethnic, racial differences, but of course representations of gender and ideal bodies.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
So
Another aspect.
that had an, yeah.
How do you choose the body for each one? Because some fit very well and others are just there.
I invited different women, and some of them, it was really by chance. It was friends of friends, and I, you know, whoever agreed. It was whoever agreed, basically. Yeah.
Did anyone have a preference on what image they were portrayed in these pieces?
Not really. I did get a lot, and I did it for myself. Here, self-criticism. I did it for myself. It was like, okay, how do I look thinner? So, you know, a lot of people were like, can you make me thin? Can you make me thin? Yes. Yeah. 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 Was there I could see, I made some choices. Some were telling, you know, different models who you were going to be. Like, I thought, you know, this is Nina. And, you know, and this is, I think this is China. And in Colombia, we use the term China a lot. Like, mi China querida, mi China linda. And so I thought that China applied, you know, it's a term of endearment, and yeah. And so different, yeah.
They seem like they're just stepping out of the background. And, you know, when I think of Central America, I think of color. You mentioned Cuba. Right? And this just seems so antithesis of that image that I have of the background. I know that it's symbolic, probably, of the harsh conditions that these people, you know, endured under colonialism. Is that what you were trying to portray with the dark background?
With the dark background?
Yeah.
I want to reference to colonial painting, to modernist painting, to the not necessarily harsh conditions. I mean, I think you want different things when you make a work of art. I wanted each one to be a striking work that together would play and be, you know, create a body of work that tells many stories.
So that wasn't part of the thought process.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think many of the masks are from, you know, they're folk art. You know, there's one from the Amazon. There's one from Mexico. There are a couple from Mexico. It's the ones that were easier to find. There are a couple from Barbados, from Ecuador. This one is from Ecuador, and this is from the Amazon. This one is too. And so I did try to, and this is why it took me 4 years, because it was finding the appropriate one for that kind of body. So it was less linked to each individual. So, you know, when you were asking, did I pick the person? Did I choose, you know, the particular person for the... No, I think this one, this friend, I thought that goes very well with who she is. Because she has a big personality, and she's, you know, she's outgoing, and I thought that's, you know, that's this friend. And I think they sometimes responded to a state of mind, my own state. Because I think in the end, there's individuality, there's your own subjectivity, your own psychology, your own stuff coming out. The curving out? I think historically that's how they were made. I mean, they're peinetas, so they're combs, so they, you know, they go on the hair like this to hold, you know, often like a moña, you know, a bun, and then over, the mantilla would go over. But again, the mantilla, when you think of the Spanish mantilla is the product of the Manila galleon. It's the silk that came from Asia, and all of the roses and the flowers that you see are all Asian iconography, but you don't think of them as Asian. You think of them as Spanish, or Mexican, or Colombian, but they are the product of that globalization, of the capitalism of that era.
All night as much as we wish we could, but thank you so much, number one, to Nancy for sharing this work. It's been I can't wait to live with them for 2 more months. I just love that they're all so in our space, and we cannot ignore them, and we cannot ignore the histories that you're bringing here to bear for us to reflect on and to move forward with. And to Christina for drawing out so many fascinating threads in this work. This has been an absolute delight to listen, and thank you for your questions and for your energy and your support of Nancy's work and exhibitions and events like this. I cannot thank you enough. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to thank the two of you. Yeah.